On Christmas Eve in 1945, 5 children vanished from their family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty Sodder were there one moment, gone the next. Their home burned to the ground in 45 minutes. But here's the thing that haunted investigators for decades. No trace of their bodies was ever found. Not a single bone. Not even a tooth? For over 70 years, this case has defied explanation. Was it a tragic accident? Or something far more sinister? The evidence points in directions that contradict each other. Strange visitors with ominous warnings. A phone line cut at the exact wrong moment. Equipment that mysteriously failed when it was needed most. And years later, a photograph that arrived in the mail with a message that would change everything the family believed. What really happened to the Sodder children on that cold December night remains one of America's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. Before we dive into today's story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories for more mysterious disappearance cases. To understand what happened that Christmas Eve, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to where the Sodder story really starts. George Sodder wasn't always George Sodder. He was born Giorgio Soddu on November 23, 1895, in the small town of Tula on the Italian island of Sardinia. When he was just 13 years old, Giorgio made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He left everything he knew and immigrated to the United States. The journey to America in 1908 was nothing like it is today. Giorgio traveled with an older brother, both of them packed into the crowded steerage compartments of a ship crossing the Atlantic. They arrived at Ellis Island with nothing but the clothes on their backs and dreams of a better future. But almost immediately, Giorgio's brother decided America wasn't for him. He turned right around and went back to Italy, leaving 13-year-old Giorgio completely alone in a foreign country where he barely spoke the language. Most kids would have crumbled under that kind of pressure. Giorgio didn't. He made his way to Pennsylvania and found work on the railroads, one of the few jobs available to young Italian immigrants at the time. He carried water and supplies to the laborers building America's expanding rail network. The work was brutal. Long hours in all kinds of weather, back-breaking labor that would test even grown men. But Giorgio was tough, and more importantly, he was smart. He anglicized his name to George Sodder and started learning everything he could about American business. After a few years on the railroads, he heard about opportunities in West Virginia's coal country. The region was booming, and George saw his chance. He moved to Smithers, West Virginia, and started working as a driver. He saved every penny he could. It was in West Virginia that George met Jenny Cipriani. Like George, Jenny had immigrated from Italy as a young child. She was 7 years younger than George, the daughter of a small shop owner. They fell in love and married, 2 Italian immigrants building a life together in the mountains of Appalachia. George wasn't content to just work for someone else. He had ambition. By the early 1920s, he'd saved enough money to start his own business. He called it the Dempsey Transfer Company, and it hauled dirt for construction projects at first, then later freight and coal from the region's mines. George had a reputation for being hard-working and honest, and his business grew steadily. The Sodders started their family almost immediately. By 1945, they had 10 children. Let me introduce you to them, because each one matters to this story. The oldest was John, 23 years old at the time of the fire, already working alongside his father in the trucking business. Then came Joseph, 21, who had just been discharged from the Army after serving in World War II. He was the only Sodder child who wasn't home on Christmas Eve, 1945. Next was Marion, 17, a responsible older sister who had spent her own money buying Christmas gifts for her younger siblings. George Jr. was 16, already helping out with the family business. These 4 were the responsible older children, the ones George and Jenny relied on. Then came the 5 middle children. Maurice was 14, on the cusp of young adulthood. Martha was 12, described by neighbors as a sweet girl who loved to read. Louis was 9, a curious boy who asked endless questions about everything. Jenny, named after her mother, was 8 years old, and Betty, the baby of this group, was just 5 years old, still full of that innocent wonder that little kids have about the world. Finally, there was 3-year-old Sylvia, the youngest Sodder child. On the night of the fire, she would be sleeping in her parents' room, a detail that would save her life. The Sodders lived about 2 miles north of Fayetteville in a large 2-story house. By the standards of 1940s Appalachia, they were doing well. The trucking business provided a comfortable life. They weren't rich, but they had everything they needed, and then some. The house was always full of noise and activity with that many kids. Laughter, arguments, the chaos that comes with a big family. George and Jenny were raising their children with a mix of Italian traditions and American values. They spoke English at home, but maintained connections to their Italian heritage. They were Catholic and attended church regularly. By all accounts, they were a normal, happy family. But there was something else about George Sodder that's important to this story. He was opinionated, especially when it came to politics. In 1945, the war in Europe had just ended. Mussolini, Italy's fascist dictator, had been executed by Italian partisans in April of that year. In the Italian immigrant community around Fayetteville, opinions about Mussolini were mixed. Some people had supported him. Others, like George, were openly critical. George didn't hold back his opinions about Mussolini. In conversations at church, at the local Italian-American club, anywhere Italians gathered, George would speak his mind. He thought Mussolini had been a disaster for Italy, a dictator who had led the country to ruin. Not everyone in the community appreciated George's vocal criticism. Some people took it personally. Some people got angry. In the months leading up to Christmas 1945, strange things started happening around the Sodder house. In October, a life insurance salesman came to the door. George and Jenny already had insurance, so George politely declined to buy another policy. That's when things got weird. The salesman didn't just leave, he got angry. His face flushed red, and he pointed his finger at George. "Your house is going to go up in smoke," the salesman said, his voice cold and threatening. "And your children are going to be destroyed. That's what you get for the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini." George was taken aback. It was such a bizarre, specific threat. Who says something like that? But the salesman turned and walked away, leaving George standing in his doorway, unsettled by the encounter. A few weeks later, another stranger showed up. This man said he was looking for work, asking if George needed any help with his trucking business. George said no, he had enough workers. But instead of leaving, the stranger wandered around to the back of the house. When he came back around front, he pointed to the 2 fuse boxes on the exterior of the house. "This is going to cause a fire someday," the stranger said, shaking his head like he was offering friendly advice. George was confused. He'd just had the house completely rewired earlier that year when they installed a new electric stove. The local power company had come out and inspected everything. They'd given him a clean bill of health, said everything was perfectly safe. Why would this stranger, who claimed to be looking for work but had no obvious electrical expertise, make such a comment? The stranger left, and George tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it lingered. Then, in the weeks before Christmas, George's older sons noticed something else. There was a car, an unfamiliar vehicle, that kept parking along the main highway near their house. Not right in front, but close enough to have a clear view. The occupants, always the same people, would sit there watching. They seemed particularly interested in the younger Sodder children when they walked home from school. George called the police about it, but nothing came of it. The car would disappear for a few days, then show up again. It felt like surveillance, like someone was watching his family. These incidents might seem unconnected to what was about to happen, just weird coincidences, random encounters with odd people, the kind of strange things that happen to everyone occasionally. But looking back, they form a pattern of warnings and threats and surveillance that would take on a much darker meaning in just a few short weeks. On Christmas Eve 1945, the Sodder family was in high spirits. The war was over. Joseph had just come home from the army the day before, though he'd gone to stay with friends that night and wasn't at the house. The rest of the family was together, excited about Christmas morning. Marion, the 17-year-old, had bought toys for her younger siblings with money she'd earned working. She was so proud to be able to give them gifts. The younger children were beside themselves with excitement. George and Jenny let them stay up later than usual to play with their new toys, a special treat for Christmas Eve. George, John, and George Jr. went to bed early. They'd all been working long hours at the trucking business and were exhausted. Around 10:30 that night, Jenny took 3-year-old Sylvia to bed with her. Before she went upstairs, she asked Maurice and Louis, the 2 oldest of the 5 middle children, to make sure the cows and chickens were taken care of for the night. The house settled into a peaceful quiet, most of the family asleep. Outside it was cold and dark, a typical December night in the West Virginia mountains. Jenny drifted off to sleep with Sylvia beside her, completely unaware that in just a few hours her world would fall apart in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. Everything was about to change. The first disturbance came at 12:30 in the morning. Jenny Sodder woke to the sound of the telephone ringing. She pulled herself out of bed, careful not to wake Sylvia, and went to answer it. When she picked up the receiver, a woman's voice came through the line. The woman asked for someone Jenny had never heard of, someone who definitely didn't live in the Sodder house. "I'm sorry, you have the wrong number," Jenny said. Instead of apologizing and hanging up, the woman did something strange. She laughed. It wasn't a polite laugh or an embarrassed laugh. It was an odd, unsettling sound. In the background, Jenny could hear other noises, the clinking of glasses, voices. It sounded like the woman was calling from a bar or party. Then the line went dead. Jenny stood there for a moment, confused. Who makes a wrong number call at 12:30 in the morning? And why laugh like that? She shook her head and went back to bed, dismissing it as just some drunk person dialing random numbers. But half an hour later, Jenny woke up again. This time it wasn't the phone. It was a sound from outside. Something heavy hit the roof of the house with a loud thump. She could hear it rolling, the sound of something round tumbling across the shingles before it fell to the ground with another thump. Jenny lay there in the darkness, listening. The house was quiet again. It must have been an animal, she thought. Maybe a branch fell from one of the trees. Nothing to worry about. She closed her eyes and fell back asleep. At 1:30 in the morning, Jenny woke for a third time. This time, it was smoke. The smell filled her nostrils, acrid and thick. Her eyes snapped open. For a split second, she was disoriented, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Then she saw it. Smoke was seeping into the bedroom. The house was on fire. "George! George, wake up! The house is on fire!" George bolted awake. Even in his panic, his first instinct was to save his children. They had to get everyone out. They had to move fast. George and Jenny grabbed Sylvia and ran out into the hallway. The smoke was thicker here, burning their eyes and throats. George started pounding on doors, yelling for the kids to wake up. John burst out of his room, then George Jr., then Marion. They could hear the fire now, the terrible crackling sound of flames consuming wood. Marion ran downstairs. Some of the younger children were already down there. Maurice and Louis had fallen asleep on the couch after taking care of the animals. Marion shook them awake. "The house is on fire! Get out! Get out now!" Everyone moved toward the doors, coughing and stumbling through the smoke. George did a mental count of his children as they gathered outside in the freezing cold. John, George Jr., Marion, Maurice and Louis from downstairs, Sylvia in Jenny's arms. Wait, where were the others? Where were Martha, Jenny, and Betty? The 3 girls had been sleeping upstairs in one of the bedrooms. They should have come out when George pounded on the doors. "Martha! Jenny! Betty!" George screamed back toward the house. No answer, just the roar of the fire, growing louder by the second. George didn't hesitate. He ran toward the house, his bare feet crunching on the frozen ground. He had to get to them. He had to get his daughters out. He reached up and grabbed the windowsill, trying to pull himself up to break into the second floor. The glass cut into his hands, slicing a deep gash in his arm. Blood ran down his wrist, but he didn't care. He had to get inside. But the fire was too intense. The heat drove him back. He couldn't get through the window. "The ladder!" George yelled to his sons. "Get the ladder!" There was a ladder that George always kept leaning against the side of the house. He used it for maintenance, for cleaning gutters, for reaching the upper floor. It should have been right there in its usual spot. It wasn't. The ladder was gone. George and his sons scrambled around the property, searching frantically in the darkness. The ladder had to be somewhere. They looked everywhere it could possibly be. Nothing. It had vanished. "The trucks!" George shouted. "We'll use the trucks." George owned 2 trucks for his business. If they couldn't find the ladder, they'd drive the trucks right up to the house and use them to climb up to the second floor. It wasn't ideal, but it would work. It had to work. George jumped into the first truck and turned the key. The engine didn't start. He tried again. Nothing. Not even a sputter. The engine was completely dead. George ran to the second truck, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. He turned that key. Nothing. Both trucks, which had been working perfectly the day before, wouldn't start. George had been using them for work just hours earlier. There was no reason they shouldn't start now. But they sat there useless while his children were trapped in a burning house. There was a water barrel next to the house, something George kept for emergencies. If they couldn't get inside, maybe they could at least fight the fire from outside. George ran to it and tried to break through the ice on top. The water was frozen solid, completely unusable. Marion had run to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. She pounded on the door until the neighbor, a woman, answered. Marion was crying, could barely get the words out. "Our house is on fire. Please call the fire department." The neighbor tried to call. The line was dead. The telephone in the Sodder house, the same phone that had rung with that strange call just an hour earlier, had been working fine. Now, suddenly the line was cut. Another neighbor, a man driving past on the main road, saw the flames. He didn't stop at the Sodder house. He drove straight into town to find Fire Chief F.J. Morris. When he finally located Morris and told him about the fire, Morris said something that would haunt the investigation forever. "I can't drive the fire truck," Morris said. Think about that for a second. The fire chief of Fayetteville, West Virginia, couldn't drive the fire truck. Whether this was true or an excuse, it meant crucial time was wasted finding someone who could drive it. Meanwhile, back at the house, the Sodders who had escaped could do nothing but stand there and watch. George, Jenny, John, George Jr., Marion, Maurice, Louis, and little Sylvia stood in the freezing December night, watching their home burn, watching everything they owned turn to ash, watching and knowing that 5 children were still inside. Or were they? That's the question that would consume the Sodder family for the rest of their lives. Because as they stood there in the bitter cold, watching the flames, something struck them as wrong. Marion said it best years later when she was interviewed by the local newspaper. "During the fire, I kept watching the windows," she said, "but I never saw even one of the children, not their faces, not their hands, nothing. I never even heard them scream, and I never smelled burning flesh. They say you can smell burning flesh miles away, but I never did." George and Jenny realized the same thing. The fire was loud, yes, but they should have heard something. The children screaming for help. The sound of windows breaking as the kids tried to get out. Something. There was nothing. The fire burned for 45 minutes before the structure finally collapsed. The Sodders watched the 2-story house fold in on itself, the walls caving inward, the roof crashing down into the inferno below. The fire department finally arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning. 8 o'clock, 7 hours after Marion had first tried to call them. The house had long since burned to the ground. There was nothing left to save, just smoking rubble and ash. Fire Chief Morris looked at the scene and made his initial assessment. "Faulty wiring," he said. The fire started from an electrical problem. George wanted to scream. The house had just been rewired. The power company had inspected it. How could it be faulty wiring? But he was too devastated to argue. 5 of his children were dead. 5 of his babies had burned to death on Christmas morning. Or had they? Because when the investigators began sifting through the debris later that Christmas day, looking for the remains of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, they found something impossible. Nothing. Not a single bone, not a fragment of a skull, not a tooth, not a piece of jewelry, not even the metal bed frames where the children had been sleeping. Everything had supposedly been consumed by the fire, cremated to nothing in 45 minutes. Chief Morris had an explanation for that, too. The fire was so hot, he said, it completely cremated the bodies. There's nothing left to find. George and Jenny wanted to believe him. They wanted to accept that their children had died quickly, that they hadn't suffered, that this was just a horrible accident. They held a funeral. 5 small caskets, all empty. The community came together to mourn with them. Death certificates were issued just before the new year, listing the cause as fire or suffocation. George covered the basement with 5 feet of dirt, intending to create a memorial garden for his lost children. Jenny planted flowers there. They tried to move forward with their grief. But doubt had already taken root in their minds. Questions they couldn't shake. Details that didn't add up. And as the weeks passed, those questions would grow into a consuming obsession that would define the rest of their lives. What they were about to discover would shatter their grief and replace it with something far worse. Hope. Jenny Sodder couldn't sleep. Every night she lay awake running through the details of the fire in her mind, and every night something felt wrong. It wasn't just a mother's grief refusing to accept reality. It was something more concrete, more disturbing. She started asking questions. The first person she talked to was a crematorium worker in Charleston, about an hour away from Fayetteville. She needed to understand the science of what Fire Chief Morris had claimed. Could human bodies really be completely cremated in 45 minutes? The crematorium worker's answer was unequivocal. No, ma'am, that's impossible. He explained the process to her. Modern crematoriums use temperatures around 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Even at that extreme heat, with bodies exposed to flames for 2 to 3 hours, bones remain. Skulls, large bones, teeth, they don't just disappear. The fragments have to be mechanically processed into what people recognize as cremated remains. A house fire burns at maybe 1,200 to 1,500 degrees, he told her, and you said your house burned for 45 minutes? There should absolutely be remains. Large bones, definitely. Probably skulls. The fact that there's nothing at all is extremely unusual. Jenny felt her heart start to race. If the worker was right, and there should have been remains, then where were they? And if there were no remains, did that mean... She couldn't finish the thought. Not yet. She needed more information. Jenny started digging into other house fires in the region, comparing them to what had happened to her family. She found a case from around the same time, another family that had lost loved ones in a fire. That blaze had burned for about the same duration as the Sodder house. When investigators sifted through the rubble, they found remains, bones, identifiable parts of bodies, everything you would expect to find. So why were the Sodder children different? George, meanwhile, was questioning Fire Chief Morris's electrical fire theory. The more he thought about it, the less sense it made. Yes, fires could start from electrical problems. But George had seen the house in those early moments. He remembered details that bothered him. The Christmas lights had still been on when they evacuated. He'd seen them twinkling in the windows even as smoke filled the house. If an electrical fault had caused the fire, shouldn't the power have gone out? Shouldn't the circuit have blown? Why would the lights stay on? And there was Jenny's phone call. At 12:30 that morning, less than an hour before the fire started, the phone had been working fine. Some drunk woman had called with a wrong number. But when Marion tried to call the fire department, the line was dead. Cut completely. Electrical fires don't cut phone lines. The two systems aren't even connected. George started talking to people around town, piecing together details that had been overlooked or dismissed in the chaos of Christmas Day. What he learned chilled him to his core. A man came forward, someone who'd been driving a bus through Fayetteville late on Christmas Eve. He'd driven past the Sodder house around midnight, maybe a little after. He told George he'd seen something strange. People outside the house, he said. They were throwing things at the building. Balls of fire, he called them. Objects that looked like they were on fire, being hurled at the roof. George remembered what Jenny had told him about waking up to something hitting the roof. That loud thump, the sound of something rolling. He'd dismissed it as a branch or an animal. But what if it was something else? A few months after the fire, when the snow had melted, 3-year-old Sylvia was playing in the brush near where the house had stood. She found something and brought it to her father. It was a small, hard object, roughly spherical, dark green in color. George examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands. "It looks like a pineapple bomb," he said quietly. Pineapple bombs were hand grenades used during World War II. They were so named because of their distinctive shape and the pattern on the exterior casing. Some models were incendiary, designed to start fires. George had heard about them from soldiers who'd come back from the war. Could someone have thrown an incendiary device onto the roof of his house? Is that what the bus driver had seen? Is that what had woken Jenny at 1 in the morning? The theory was almost too terrible to consider. Because if the fire had been set deliberately, that meant everything else, all those strange coincidences, might not have been coincidences at all. George thought about the insurance salesman. Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. That had been in October, 2 months before the fire. Was that a threat or a prediction? He thought about the stranger who'd warned him about the fuse boxes. This is going to cause a fire someday. Was he planting the idea so investigators would assume it was electrical? He thought about the car that had been watching his younger children. Were they choosing targets? Figuring out which kids would be in which rooms? And the ladder that had mysteriously disappeared from its usual spot. The trucks that wouldn't start even though they'd been working fine hours before. The phone line that had been cut. The water barrel frozen solid. Each individual thing could be explained away. Bad luck. Coincidence. The chaos of a terrible tragedy. But all of them together? That started to look like a plan. Like sabotage. Like someone had wanted to make absolutely sure the fire department couldn't be called and the family couldn't fight the blaze. But why would anyone do that? What possible reason could there be to target the Sodder family? George came back to the only thing that made sense, as crazy as it sounded. The Mussolini comments, his vocal criticism of the Italian dictator. In a community of Italian immigrants, some of whom had supported Mussolini, George had made enemies. Had someone decided to punish him for his opinions? Then another witness came forward. A woman who lived near the Sodder house said she'd been awakened by the fire that night. When she looked out her window, she saw something that had bothered her ever since. There was a car parked on the road near the Sodder property. The fire was raging, but the car was just sitting there. Then, as she watched, she saw 5 children get into the car with 2 adults she didn't recognize. The children, she said, looked like they might have been the Sodder children. She couldn't be certain in the darkness and confusion, but the ages seemed right. The car had driven away before the fire department arrived. George and Jenny didn't know whether to feel elated or terrified. If their children had been taken, they might still be alive. But where were they? Who had them? And why? More witnesses started coming forward, each with a piece of information that seemed to support the kidnapping theory. A waitress at a truck stop about 50 miles from Fayetteville said she'd served breakfast to 5 children on Christmas morning. She remembered because it was unusual to see kids in the diner that early, especially on Christmas. The children had been with 2 adults who kept the kids very quiet. When the waitress tried to make conversation with the kids, the adults had cut her off and hurried them out. She'd thought it was odd at the time. When she heard about the Sodder fire later, she wondered if those might have been the missing children. But by the time she came forward, weeks had passed. The trail was cold. Another woman reported seeing 4 of the Sodder children at a hotel in South Carolina. She said she was certain it was them because she'd seen their pictures in the newspaper. They'd been with adults who claimed to be relatives, but something about the situation felt off to her. The children seemed subdued, almost frightened. Again, by the time this tip reached the Sodder family, the opportunity to investigate had passed. George and Jenny were desperate. They contacted the FBI, writing letters directly to J. Edgar Hoover, the director. Surely the FBI would help find their children. Surely this was exactly the kind of case the Bureau should investigate. Hoover wrote back personally, but his response was crushing. The FBI would not be taking the case. This was a local matter, he said. The Sodders should work with their local police and fire departments, but the local authorities had already made up their minds. The children had died in the fire. Case closed. When George tried to push for further investigation, he was met with resistance and, in some cases, outright hostility. The Sodders decided to take matters into their own hands. They hired private investigators, spending their savings to chase down every lead, every tip, every whisper of information. The investigators found tantalizing clues but no definitive answers. In early 1946, the family decided to excavate the site where their house had stood. Maybe the initial search had been incomplete. Maybe there were remains that had been overlooked in the chaos of Christmas Day. They needed to know. They brought in equipment and workers and began carefully digging through the dirt George had used to fill in the basement. It was grueling, heartbreaking work. Every shovelful might contain some trace of their children. But they had to know the truth. The excavation took weeks. They sifted through every bit of debris, examining everything carefully. What they found only deepened the mystery. There were household items exactly what you'd expect to find in the ruins of a house. Melted glass, twisted metal, fragments of furniture. But of the 5 children who had supposedly perished in the fire, nothing. No bones, no teeth, no trace whatsoever. They did find something interesting, though. A small piece of what appeared to be vertebrae, part of a human spine. Finally, proof that someone had died in the fire. George carefully preserved the fragment and sent it to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The results came back weeks later. The bone fragment showed no evidence of fire damage. None. If it had been in the house during the fire, it should have shown at least some effects from the heat and flames. The analysts concluded it had probably been mixed in with the dirt George had used to fill the basement. It wasn't from anyone who'd died in the fire. Another dead end. But there was more. Fire Chief Morris, the same man who'd been so quick to declare the fire an electrical accident, had apparently been hiding something. When confronted by George, Morris admitted that he'd found what he thought was a human heart among the debris shortly after the fire. Instead of properly documenting it and sending it for analysis, he'd buried it in a box on the property. Why? Morris claimed he thought he'd already told the Sodders about it, but that was obviously false. George and Jenny would never have forgotten something like that. Morris went with them to show them where he'd buried the box, and they dug it up. George took the organ directly to a funeral director who had experience with such things. The director examined it and gave his assessment immediately. This is a beef liver, not a human heart. A beef liver. Someone, possibly Morris himself, had planted a piece of meat at the fire scene, then found it and buried it. Was this an attempt to placate the family, to give them something to bury and help them move on? Or was it something more sinister, an attempt to manufacture evidence to support the official story? Before George could demand answers, the box with the organ went missing. It had been left on the porch, and when they went to look for it the next day, it was gone. Morris claimed it must have been picked up by waste disposal, but that was never confirmed. Every answer led to more questions. Every piece of evidence seemed to contradict the official story. And yet, the local authorities refused to reopen the case. In desperation, George and Jenny took their story public. They erected a billboard along Route 16, the main highway through Fayetteville. The billboard featured photographs of the 5 missing children, their names, and their ages. Below the photos it asked, what was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive? They offered a reward, $5,000 initially, a fortune in the 1940s. When that didn't produce results, they increased it to $10,000. They distributed flyers throughout West Virginia and beyond. They talked to any reporter who would listen. The billboard became a landmark. For almost 40 years, anyone driving through Fayetteville would see those 5 faces staring out, a constant reminder of the mystery, a constant plea for information, and slowly tips started coming in. Some were clearly hoaxes, others seemed more credible. George and Jenny chased every single one, no matter how unlikely. A woman in St. Louis said she'd seen Martha in a convent there. The Sodders sent investigators. The girl turned out to be someone else. A man in Texas claimed he'd overheard a conversation in a bar about a fire in West Virginia on Christmas Eve, 1945. The details he'd overheard suggested the people talking knew something about what had really happened. Investigators followed up, but the lead went nowhere. Year after year, the tips came in. Year after year, George and Jenny followed up on every single one. They spent their savings, their retirement, everything they had. Because what else could they do? Give up? Accept that their children were gone when there was even the slightest possibility they were alive somewhere? But the biggest lead, the one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, wouldn't arrive until 1967. 22 years after the fire, an envelope showed up at the Sodder house. It was postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. There was no return address, no note, just an envelope with a photograph inside. The photograph showed a young man in his mid-20s. He had dark, curly hair and strong features. And on the back of the photograph, someone had written a message. Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie. Lil boys. A90132 or 35. Jenny Sodder's hands were shaking when she turned the photograph over and read the message on the back. She brought it into the light, studying the young man's face with an intensity that made her eyes burn. Louis would be 28 years old now. This man looked about the right age, and the resemblance was uncanny. The dark curly hair that all the Sodder children had inherited from their Italian parents. The shape of the jaw, the eyes, it looked like Louis. It really did. But there were questions, so many questions. Who was Frankie? None of the Sodder children had been named Frankie. Was it a nickname? A code? Someone who had taken Louis in? What did Lil boys mean? Was it a place? An organization? A misspelling of something? And the numbers. A90132 or 35. Were those addresses? ID numbers? Some kind of code? George and Jenny immediately contacted law enforcement and private investigators. They needed to trace where this photograph had come from. Central City, Kentucky. That was a real place, a small town about 300 miles from Fayetteville. Who had sent this, and why wait 22 years? Investigators traveled to Central City. They canvassed the town, showing the photograph to residents. Did anyone recognize this man? Had anyone seen the Sodder children? They checked addresses, trying to make sense of the numbers on the back of the photo. Nothing. The trail was cold before it even started. Whoever had sent that photograph had been careful. No return address, no fingerprints that could be lifted. Just a photograph and a cryptic message that could mean everything or nothing. George had the photograph analyzed by experts. They enlarged it, studying every detail. One expert said the photo looked like it had been taken in the early 1950s, based on the style and quality. If true, that meant it had been taken 5 to 7 years after the fire, then held on to for more than 15 years before being mailed to the Sodders. Why? Why wait so long? The most heartbreaking possibility was that someone had been watching the Sodder family all along. Someone knew they were still searching. Someone wanted them to know that at least one of the children had survived but didn't want to be found, or couldn't be found. Jenny became convinced the photograph was real, that it was her son Louis, now a grown man. She studied it every day, comparing it to the baby pictures she had of Louis. The more she looked, the more certain she became. George was more skeptical. He wanted to believe. God, he wanted to believe. But he'd chased so many false leads over the years. He'd had his heart broken over and over again by tips that went nowhere, sightings that turned out to be other children, witnesses who misremembered or outright lied. We can't know for sure, he told Jenny gently. We just can't know. But Jenny kept the photograph. She carried it with her. She showed it to anyone who would look. Maybe someone, somewhere, would recognize the man. Maybe he'd see his own picture and realize who he was. Maybe. The photograph reignited public interest in the case. Newspapers ran stories about the mysterious envelope. Television shows featured the Sodder children. The case that had gone cold for years was suddenly hot again. New tips came in. A woman in Florida said she was certain she'd gone to school with Martha Sodder in the 1950s. The girl had gone by a different name, but this woman was convinced it was her. Investigators followed up. The woman they found was not Martha. A man claimed he'd been in an orphanage in the late 40s with several children who'd been brought in after a fire. They'd been told their parents were dead, but the details he remembered seemed to match the Sodder children. By the time investigators tracked down the orphanage's records, they'd been destroyed in a separate fire. The lead died there. George and Jenny never stopped searching. Even as they grew older, even as the years stretched into decades, they never gave up hope. The billboards stayed up. The rewards stayed offered. They talked to anyone who would listen. Their surviving children carried on the search too. Marion became particularly devoted to finding her lost siblings. She collected newspaper clippings, followed up on tips, maintained correspondence with investigators and tipsters around the country. She'd bought those Christmas presents for her younger brothers and sisters. She'd watched the house burn. She'd spent her whole life haunted by that night. In 1968, George Sodder passed away. He was 73 years old. He died without ever knowing what happened to his children, without ever getting the answers he'd spent more than 2 decades searching for. Jenny continued the search alone. She lived in a house in Fayetteville, a different house than the one that had burned, but she never truly moved on. The loss defined her life. Every Christmas was a reminder. Every birthday of one of the missing children was another year of not knowing. She gave interviews to newspapers and television shows. She appeared on the television series Unsolved Mysteries in the late 80s, appealing once again to the public for help. By then she was an elderly woman, but her determination hadn't wavered. "I still believe they're alive somewhere," she said on camera, her voice steady despite her age. "Someone knows what happened. Someone knows where they are." The segment generated thousands of new tips. People from all over the country called in, wrote letters, claimed to have information. Jenny and her surviving children followed up on everyone. But as before, nothing concrete emerged. In 1989, Jenny Sodder passed away at the age of 84. She died as George had, without answers, without knowing if her children had suffered or if they'd lived full lives somewhere else under different names, without the closure that most people take for granted. The surviving Sodder children, now elderly themselves, continued to search. Marion, Sylvia, and the others who'd escaped the fire that night had lived their entire lives in the shadow of that Christmas Eve. They'd raised their own families, had careers, experienced joys and sorrows, but the question was always there, hanging over every holiday, every family gathering. Where were Maurice, Martha, Louie, Jenny, and Betty? The case attracted attention from true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators over the years. Theories proliferated. Some believed it was a simple house fire, and the bodies had somehow been completely consumed, despite what crematorium experts said was impossible. Others were convinced the children had been kidnapped, possibly taken to Italy or sold to families who couldn't have children of their own. Still others thought it might have been connected to organized crime or wartime grudges. In 2008, the billboard that George and Jenny had erected in 1946 was finally taken down. It had stood for 62 years, weathered and faded, but still showing the faces of the 5 missing children. The current landowner needed to make repairs to the structure, and the Sodder descendants agreed it was time. But even without the billboard, the case lives on. It's become one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American history. Books have been written about it. Documentaries have been made. Podcasts have covered it extensively. Modern investigators have looked at the case with fresh eyes and new technology. Some have suggested that DNA testing of living Sodder descendants could potentially identify the man in the 1967 photograph if he or his descendants could ever be located. But without knowing who or where he is, that's a dead end. Others have theorized that the children died in the fire, and the sightings afterward were cases of mistaken identity, combined with the family's desperate need to believe their children survived. The absence of remains, they argue, could be explained by the intense heat of the fire in specific areas where the children were sleeping, combined with an incomplete initial investigation. But this theory doesn't explain the cut phone line. It doesn't explain the ladder that disappeared or the trucks that wouldn't start. It doesn't explain the threatening insurance salesman or the strange visitor who warned about the fuse boxes. It doesn't explain the bus driver who saw people throwing fireballs at the house. It doesn't explain the photograph that arrived 22 years later. The truth is, we may never know what really happened to the Sodder children. The people who could answer those questions are almost certainly all dead now. Maurice would be 93 years old today. Martha would be 91. Louis would be 88. Jenny would be 87. Betty would be 84. If they survived the fire and were taken somewhere, they would have lived full lives by now. They might have children and grandchildren of their own, families who know them by completely different names and have no idea about a Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia in 1945. Or they might have died as children, their remains lost to history, their final moments known only to whoever took them that night. The surviving Sodder children are passing away now. Sylvia, the youngest, who was only 3 when the fire happened, passed away in 2010. She was the last one who had clear memories of her missing siblings. The descendants still search, though less actively than George and Jenny did. The story has been passed down through generations of the family. The mystery remains unsolved. So, what really happened on Christmas Eve, 1945? Let's examine the main theories that have emerged over the decades, because each one tells us something about how hard it is to find truth when the evidence points in multiple directions. The official theory, accidental fire with complete cremation. This is what Fire Chief Morris concluded and what the death certificates state. An electrical fault caused a fire that burned so intensely it completely cremated 5 children, leaving no trace whatsoever. The evidence supporting this theory is minimal. Yes, the house burned. Yes, 5 children were never seen again by their family. But that's where the supporting evidence ends. The evidence against this theory is substantial. Multiple crematorium experts have stated it's functionally impossible for a house fire burning for 45 minutes to completely cremate human remains. The Christmas lights were still on during the fire, which contradicts an electrical fault. The excavation of the site found no remains. The piece of vertebrae that was found showed no fire damage. This theory also requires us to dismiss all the suspicious circumstances as coincidences. The cut phone line, the missing ladder, the trucks that wouldn't start, the threats from the insurance salesman, the strange visitors, the objects thrown at the roof, the sightings of the children after the fire. That's a lot of coincidences. The kidnapping theory, revenge, or human trafficking. This is the theory George and Jenny came to believe. Someone targeted their family, set the fire as a distraction, and took the 5 children while everyone was confused and panicking. The motive in this version was revenge. George had been openly critical of Mussolini in a community where some Italian immigrants still had sympathies for the fascist regime. Maybe someone decided to punish him in the cruelest way possible, not by killing his children, but by taking them and making him wonder for the rest of his life what had happened to them. Alternatively, the children could have been taken for human trafficking purposes. In the chaos of post-World War II America, children did occasionally disappear into black markets. They were sold to families who couldn't have children of their own, or in the darkest scenarios, to worse fates. The evidence supporting this theory includes the witness who saw children being put into a car near the house that night, the waitress who served breakfast to 5 children, matching their description on Christmas morning, the woman who saw 4 children at a hotel in South Carolina, the numerous other sightings over the years, the photograph that arrived in 1967. The evidence against this theory is the lack of any definitive proof. None of the sightings were confirmed. The photograph, while compelling, was never traced to a real person. If the children were taken and raised elsewhere, why did none of them ever come forward as adults? Surely at some point, one of them would have questioned their identity or tried to find their birth family. Unless, of course, they'd been told their birth parents were dead. or unless something had happened to them that prevented them from ever coming forward. The hybrid theory, accidental death with cover-up. This theory suggests the children did die, but not in the fire. Something else happened, either accident or crime, and the fire was set to cover it up. Maybe the children were already dead when the fire started. Maybe they'd been killed elsewhere and their bodies hidden. The fire was set to destroy any evidence and provide a convenient explanation. This theory could explain why no remains were found. If the bodies weren't in the house when it burned, there would be nothing to find. It could explain the sabotage, the cut phone line, the missing ladder, all of it designed to ensure the fire burned long enough and hot enough to destroy any evidence that might have been planted. But this theory has problems too. It requires a level of planning and coordination that seems extreme. Who would go to such lengths, and why? What could 5 children possibly have witnessed or been involved in that would warrant this kind of cover-up? Let's strip away the speculation and focus on what can be verified. We know the Sodder house burned on Christmas Eve, 1945. We know 5 children were in the house when the fire started and were never seen again by their family. We know no remains were found during multiple excavations of the site. We know George Sodder had received threats about his house burning and his children being destroyed. We know there were strange visitors in the months before the fire. We know the phone line was cut. We know the ladder was missing from its usual spot. We know both trucks wouldn't start. We know multiple witnesses claimed to see the children after the fire, but none of these sightings were definitively confirmed. We know a photograph arrived in 1967 with a cryptic message suggesting one child might have survived. We know George and Jenny Sodder spent the rest of their lives searching for answers and died without finding them. Everything else is theory, speculation, or belief. If the children died in the fire, why were no remains found? Not even teeth, which can survive extreme heat? If the children were kidnapped, who took them and why? What happened to them? Who sent the photograph in 1967? Was it really Lewis, or was it someone cruel enough to give false hope to a grieving family? What was thrown onto the roof that night? Was it the incendiary device George suspected? Who cut the phone line? Who moved the ladder? Did someone sabotage the trucks? Were the threats from the insurance salesman and the warning from the stranger about the fuse boxes connected to what happened? What did the bus driver really see when he drove past that night? Were any of the post-fire sightings legitimate? These questions have haunted investigators, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts for nearly 80 years. They may never be answered. The people who knew the truth are almost certainly all gone now. The Sodder Children case has become a symbol of several things in American culture. It represents the agony of not knowing, the hell of ambiguous loss. George and Jenny Sodder couldn't bury their children and grieve properly because they never knew for certain what had happened. That uncertainty, that eternal hope mixed with eternal fear, is a special kind of torture. The case also highlights how investigations can fail. Whether through incompetence, indifference, or something more sinister, the initial investigation into the fire was woefully inadequate. Evidence was destroyed or lost. Witnesses weren't properly interviewed. The site wasn't thoroughly examined until the family did it themselves months later. If the fire had been properly investigated from the beginning, if someone had taken the cut phone line and missing ladder seriously, if the claimed human heart had been properly analyzed instead of buried, we might know the truth today. The case has influenced how missing children cases are handled. The idea that child victims of disasters should be accounted for, that remains should be found and identified, that families deserve answers, these concepts seem obvious now, but weren't always prioritized in the 1940s. The Sodder family's refusal to give up, their decades-long search, their willingness to spend every penny they had chasing leads, has inspired other families of missing persons. It showed that you don't have to accept official explanations if they don't make sense. You have the right to demand answers. You have the right to keep searching. But it also shows the heartbreak that comes with that search. George and Jenny Sodder never got their answers. They died with their questions. Their surviving children have lived entire lifetimes without knowing what happened to their siblings. Was it worth it? The years of searching? The money spent? The hope that was repeatedly crushed and repeatedly rekindled? Only the Sodder family can answer that. But they never stopped looking, not even when it seemed hopeless, not even when everyone else had moved on, because how do you give up on your children? How do you stop searching when you don't know if they're alive or dead, suffering or safe? You don't. You can't. And so the search continued, year after year, decade after decade, until finally there was no one left who remembered Maurice's laugh or Martha's smile, or Louis's questions, or Jenny's gentleness, or Betty's wonder. Now there are only photographs, faces frozen in time. 5 children who never got to grow up. Or did they? We'll never know. The story of the Sodder children is one that defies easy answers. It's a case that raises more questions than it resolves, that offers tantalizing clues without providing definitive proof. Were Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder victims of a tragic house fire, their remains somehow completely consumed, despite what science says should be impossible? Or were they kidnapped by someone with a grudge against their father, taken in the chaos and confusion of that Christmas Eve night, and raised under different names in different places? Did they live full lives somewhere else, never knowing who they really were? Or did they die that night, their final moments known only to those who took them? The truth is buried somewhere in the past, locked away with people who are no longer alive to tell it. The physical evidence is long gone. The witnesses have all passed away. The children themselves, if they survived, would be in their 80s and 90s now. What remains is the story, a mystery that has captivated people for nearly 80 years. A reminder that sometimes, despite our best efforts, despite our most desperate searches, we don't get answers. We don't get closure. We just get questions that echo through generations. George and Jenny Sodder spent their entire lives searching for their children. They never gave up hope, never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, they might find the truth. Their dedication was extraordinary. Their pain was unimaginable. Today, the case remains officially unsolved. The 5 Sodder children are still listed as missing, their fate unknown. Their story has become a part of American folklore, a cautionary tale, and an enduring mystery. If you have any information about the Sodder children case, contact the Fayetteville Police Department in West Virginia. Even after all these years, the family deserves answers. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Seek Stories for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries and true crime cases. What theory do you think is most likely? Do you believe the children perished in the fire, or do you think they were taken? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.